So when you're working on your VR project, there's most likely going to be a point in time where you need the user to see something, like a board of information or some instructions or a marker that's off in the distance. But in VR, it can be pretty difficult to make sure that they actually see that thing. And to do that, we usually have some sort of functionality that takes into account where the player is looking, and we place something in front of their vision. Today, I'm just going to show you a really quick example of how to do that. And for my example, I just have this simple sphere with a script that I've just called Vision Follower that's going to follow the camera transform. I also have a distance so I can control how far the object is going to place itself from the player's camera. And that's pretty much it for the scene. There's nothing special about it. Let's take a look at the script really quick so I can explain a few things. And for this to kind of work, there's 2 or 3 primary pieces that we need to do. We need to detect when the object is no longer visible from where the player is looking. We need to find the new position that the object needs to be at, and then we need to move it there. And for that first part, for detecting if the object is in the player's view, there's a lot of different ways of handling that. If the object has a mesh renderer, we can check if it's visible. We could take its world space position and translate it to screen space to see if it's within a valid range, or using a different method using the dot product. For this really simple implementation, I'm just using this onBecameInvisible function. And this is built into Unity, so we don't have to do any extra functionality to do this. And this is particularly useful for VR because within your scene, you're most likely going to only have one camera, which is going to be the player's. This is important to note because if any camera can see this object, this transform or this function isn't going to work very well. And this even accounts within your scene view, so even your scene camera can prevent this function from actually being triggered. So just a word of warning. But once this object is no longer visible, I just want to set this id-centered boolean to false. That's so an update is once this object is no longer centered within the player's view, we need to do those 2 other things we talked about, which is finding that new position and beginning to move the object towards it. And for finding that target position, it's actually pretty straightforward. We're just going to take the position of our camera. We're going to use its forward vector to get a position more or less in the direction that the player is looking, and then we multiply that by some value, which is going to be our distance. And in my case, I just put 3 meters. For your use case, it may differ, so be sure to play with its value a little bit. And once we have that target position, we want to start to move towards it. And you may be thinking, oh, why didn't you use lerp or why didn't you use a tween? The main thing is I didn't want to use a tween because since we're always going to be looking around the scene, it's going to be very difficult to use a tween unless we just want it to move to a position that the player was looking at. And this works pretty well because even if the player is slowly looking around, the object will still follow its vision instead of just going to a particular point and waiting there until the player has looked away. And if that's something you wanted to do, you could probably store an additional position once the object became invisible and then just move to that position instead. But what I used here is a simple function to take the difference in position from where we are to where we want to be and multiplying it by this small value. And what it does is it creates a sort of easing look so it doesn't have a very linear motion and gives it a really nice feel. And we also need to detect once we've reached our position, and I've just done that using this simple vector 3 distance check. If you want something a bit more performant, or you even know what I'm talking about here, you probably have something that you would rather put here, but I like this since it's fairly straightforward, and I imagine that I'm not going to have hundreds of these objects within my scene running at the same time. But going back up to update, once this distance check is true, we want to also mark is center to true as well. And this ensures that once the object has reached the center of the player's screen, we're not going to be running any more functionality. And that's about it for this little snippet of code. If you find it useful, feel free to leave a comment below. And if you have any other code snippets that you may find useful in your project, but you're not necessarily sure how to do it, feel free to leave a comment below. And that's it for me. I'll see you all in the next one.